Fan Expo New Orleans. Welcome. Full disclosure, this is my first time ever doing this panel, and I'm very excited. I put all of this together specifically for this convention, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how, my relationship with the Back to the Future trilogy. But nonetheless, welcome to Doc, You're My Only Hope, exploring relationships, attachment, and life in the Back to the Future trilogy. And so, before we get started, I'll just introduce myself. My name is Dr. Vanessa. My pronouns are she and her. I am based just west of Milwaukee in Waukesha, Wisconsin. And I have several jobs, like 52 jobs, I don't even know. Like many psychologists, I am a professor. So I teach students at Carroll University who are training to be counselors and therapists. So that is like my main job. And in addition to that, I work as a consultant in diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is a good time. I'm also, if you can't tell, a pop culture enthusiast. I love pop culture. I love to utilize pop culture not only in my teaching, but also in the work that I do with clients, and in research, just all kinds of things. I think pop culture is a treasure trove for healing, and for instilling belonging in folks. And so I love it. And I have a podcast, which I will mention probably a gajillion times, in which I talk about how we can use fandom and stories in popular culture to promote healing. And so that's a little bit about me. And before we get into talking specifically about Back to the Future, I have a confession. So I was 2 weeks ago years old when I watched Back to the Future for the first time. Like, mind you, Back to the Future is about to turn 40 whole years old. And I had never seen any of those films until 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago. And so as a late 80s baby, I think it's kind of, I'll say blasphemous, that I've never seen any of those films. And I think it was a very unique experience to watch them all for the first time, like nearly 40 years after the release. And also as like a whole full-ass grown adult. I think that was just a very, very interesting experience. So before we start talking about some themes in the trilogy in particular, I want to share with you all some of my reactions as I was watching the films. And again, watching films that were made 40 years ago, now in the year 2024, was just an interesting experience. And so the first Back to the Future movie was released in 1985. I myself was not yet on this earth when that movie was released. Nonetheless, for me, the first Back to the Future, my initial reaction, my initial sort of thinking about it was that it was absolutely 100% like a movie straight from the 80s. It made me feel like a sense of nostalgia, sense of comfort. There were also far too many cringy moments for my taste. I would say I think the entirety of the storyline of Marty's parents and, his mom was super turned up, which we'll talk about a little bit more specifically. But I think viewing this movie in the context of 2024 and my life and my ways of thinking and my perspectives, it was a bit difficult. There were some aspects of it that I physically was white knuckling it because I'm ooh, this is super gross. But we'll talk a little bit more about that specifically. But regardless of those things, I think an amazing movie, and I see why people love it. I see why it is endeared. And I think the way that Doc Brown and Marty McFly, their sort of relationship and their interactions are just absolutely beautiful, and I loved every second of it. Now, Back to the Future 2, released in 1989. This one was, I think, for me, the one that was also a little bit, and I'll say cringy because some of the parts I think were difficult to watch, particularly Bad Biff and all of that was going on. But I think what was most interesting to me about Back to the Future 2 was the perception of the year 2015. All the flying cars and the holograms and shit. 2015 at this point was 10 years ago, and we still don't have none of that. And so it's just interesting to think how in the late 80s people conceptualized the year 2015. Because I'm trying to even remember what happened in 2015. What was going on? I know we didn't have no flying cars, though. Did we have hoverboards? I think we might have. At that time had hoverboards. But nonetheless, I think that was that was a very interesting aspect of that movie to me, as was Marty's family. And I think the entirety of the plot to stop this certain like triggering event from happening, so his family didn't end up the way that they did. I just thought that it was very, very interesting. Very interesting. And then lastly, Back to the Future Part 3. So listen, y'all, when I realized that it was going to be a Western and that they were going to go so far back in time, I think as like a black person in America, thinking about them going back to 1885, I was like, whoa, I don't know if I want to watch this movie, actually. Like, I don't know how intense it's going to be, right? And it ended up not being bad, I think. And what I will also say, which I think doesn't often happen, but I think they ended this movie or this trilogy in an amazing way. Like, I think the resolution, the hope, spoiler alert, that this movie left folks with, I think that I remember texting a good friend of mine after I finished, and I was like, I see why people absolutely love this trilogy. It was ended very well. Again, the themes and everything, I think, was just very amazing. So with that being said, so the first, to me, maybe most, and maybe it was the most obvious for me, theme in Back to the Future, and I think it's more so occupational hazard as a therapist, as a psychologist. This was something that was just very salient and apparent to me, but it's this idea of cognitive dissonance. And so cognitive dissonance is basically a fancy way of saying that when there is inconsistencies between two thoughts that we have, it makes us feel uncomfortable. And so when we experience cognitive dissonance, we oftentimes experience sort of like a heightened state. So we can get really hungry, we can get really anxious, we can get really sad. So again, cognitive dissonance is the experience of having two thoughts that are simultaneously contrary, and trying to hold those two thoughts at the same time. That leads to some sort of intense feeling, and as a result, we want to get rid of that feeling. So we are then motivated to get rid of that uncomfortable feeling that dissonance sort of creates. And this is something that is super common, right? And so what this looks like in Back to the Future, and again, I just sort of referenced it a few moments ago, when Marty goes back to 1955 and he interacts with the younger versions of his parents, right? And his mom is like all the way turned up, like trying to get fresh with him. And it's like trying to hold the thought in your mind that this is my mom, and that she doesn't know who he is, so he can't, like how does he say to her, like, please do not put your hand on my thigh, Mom? You know what I'm saying? And so for me, those were some of the cringier parts of the film, right? To watch Marty interacting with particularly his mom, right? Like, she was super turned up. She was super jazzed. The other one that I think was particularly salient to me was when we discovered that Marty's dad was literally like a voyeur, like a peeping Tom. And so we hear at the beginning of the first Back to the Future film that Marty's parents met because his mom's dad hit his dad with a car, right? Like on accident or whatever. They were outside. Marty's dad, George, was outside Lorraine's house, and we learn in this whole flashback situation that the reason he was outside of her house is because he was watching her undress through the window. And it's like, whoa, like what was a very endearing story is now like next level creepy, right? And so I think for not only me as a viewer, there was some dissonance there, because I too am not trying to be judgmental of Lorraine, because she doesn't know Marty is her son, so she really is just here with all these teenage hormones trying to get fresh. And like, it was super gross. It was super gross, right? So how do we navigate those two things? And again, that is in essence what cognitive dissonance is. So the next theme, and again, I think one that is more relatable to a lot of folks, and I think another reason that this trilogy has essentially stood the test of time, and that is this concept of identity and family, and how the two sort of correlate, right? Like how the two are correlated. And I think, again, part of what I really particularly appreciated about the movies, are the dynamics and the relationships, particularly between Doc Brown and Marty, which we'll talk about much more specifically. But again, I think Marty was just a super cool like cool, compassionate, empathic dude. Like he was super cool. So I think first it's important to acknowledge that our family relationships play, and again, I'm defining family very loosely, right? Like I'm not just talking about your biological family, but anyone who is considered sort of like a close person in your life. But for the sake of this conversation, I think thinking about the people who are important to you in your life when you are going through your formidable years. So there's so much growth and development for folks from childhood into adolescence and early adulthood, that the relationships that we have with people, which are particularly relationships we have with our families, are significant in shaping how we identify, right? And so just some of the various factors that can influence our identity, particularly from our family. The first is like our family's identity, right? And we see that in the initial Back to the Future film where Principal Strickland treats Marty in the same way that he treated his dad. Like, you McFly is like, oh, you are all slackers and lazy. And so there's this idea that your family identity becomes your identity, which I think is not good, bad, or otherwise. It just is what it is. I also think that our family relationships and our sort of early relationships are part of our individual narratives and our individual stories, and our individual narratives, stories, and experiences influence how we identify. So that is absolutely a way that family plays a role, as is the values that are instilled in us at an early age. There are times where we carry those values on into our lives. There are other times where we might recognize as we get older that we don't share the same values that maybe we were reared with, and so we develop alternative values, and then there's everything in between. And then lastly, I think in our early relationships, whether that be with our bio family, found family, or otherwise, in these early relationships, we learn how to care for other people. And I think that becomes part of our identities as well. And so as we talk about this specifically as it relates to Back to the Future, and for those of you who can see the screen here, pictured is again, Principal Strickland and Marty McFly. But I think that there are some folks who believe and who will say that it is impossible to overcome or outgrow these influences of family. And I would argue that that's absolutely not the case. I do not believe we are deterministic in that way. I think that we have the ability to have some level of control over the way our family influences us in our stories. And again, I think we see that particularly throughout the Back to the Future narrative as we move in between films, that we can choose to accept or reject the way that our family relationships and identity influence how we identify. I know that sometimes it can feel as if we don't have that capacity, as if we don't have the ability to do that, and that's something I think I very much appreciate about Back to the Future, is that we see this sort of 3-movie journey of both Marty and Doc Brown really coming to, spoiler alert, acknowledge that they have some free will, agency, and control over how they make sense of their experiences and how they use those experiences to shape the way that they think about themselves and their relationships with other people. And I think a great example of this is, again, particularly in the first film, where Marty's entire quest in going back into 1955 is to make sure that his parents meet as they need to and get together as they need to so that Marty and his siblings can actually come into existence, right? But what I think is interesting about Marty's experience in 1955 is that he does a lot more than just ensure that his parents meet so that he and his siblings can be born, right? Like, he actually influences his parents to the point that their future is changed. And so when we see at the end of the film, Marty returns back to 1985, and now his parents are like skinny and fly and fresh. And so it's very clear that not only did Marty elect to ensure that he was born and that his siblings were born and that things went the way that they were, quote, supposed to, but he actually did a little bit more, which, again, we can argue about the ethics of that. Like, was that his place to do that? Why did he do that? What have you? Nonetheless, I think that was an example of what I just sort of referenced in terms of, and again, in a very sort of dramatized sci-fi type of way, but there was an opportunity for him to exert a little bit more control over how his experiences shape his identity. The other thing I'll say before we transition is, and I sort of preface this, but this idea of family is not just the people that we sort of have biological connections to, and I'm sure people are familiar with this term found family or chosen family, but a found family is essentially a group of people who are united by a mutual support system, love, and respect, rather than some sort of biological connection. And so found family is also referred to as a trope in literature and media, where groups of characters form a family bond based on their shared experiences. And again, I think one of my most favorite things about Back to the Future, besides like the fashion, like I was here for all the fashion in Back to the Future, whether it was 80s fashion, whatever. I just feel like everybody always looks so fabulous, except Doc Brown. I feel like he always just has something going on. But nonetheless, I think to me one of the most amazing aspects of the films is the relationship between Marty and Doc Brown. And again, it's like never really explained. Like that was something that was very interesting to me. Like I remember the first Back to the Future film, like when I started watching it, first of all, that whole first opening scene of the movie where there's like all those clocks, and I just felt very anxious because like all the clocks were ticking at the same time. It was just like very quiet and nobody was saying anything. But I feel like it's never really explained like what the relationship is between Marty and Doc Brown. Like we just are sort of brought into this story when Marty is like, it's just established that he's like cool with this dude. And he does stuff for this old scientist guy. And I think that's beautiful. It's like a story that doesn't require an explanation. It just is what it is. And I think that is what found family is. There's no biological imperative that you have to care about someone. You choose to do that. You choose to be in relationship with them. You choose to care about them. And I think that, again, there's something so empowering about being able to choose who you love and who you are in relationship and create community with. And so the last theme I want to talk about, and again, I think it's something that is sort of something when people think about Back to the Future is something that comes up quite often, and that is, what is our individual capacity for change? And I sort of referenced this a little bit just a few minutes ago, talking about determinism versus free will, but that's specifically what we're going to talk about now, because I think there is a shift in this thinking, not only for Marty, but for Doc Brown as the films progress. And so I think it's worth noting. And so before sort of getting into the specifics about what this looks like in the film, I think just so we all have a shared understanding about what these different phrases and terms mean. So when we say something is deterministic, this is the belief that our actions and decisions are predetermined. And so no matter what we've done in our lives, whatever is supposed to happen is going to happen. And determinism really suggests that people's choices are a result of like a chain of events, and that we as individuals are not truly free. Now, again, that sounds super philosophical, super existential, and we can debate that at a later time. This is sort of not a philosophy symposium. Just as sort of some people, this is the way some people think about existence, right? Like, no matter what I do, if something is meant to be, like, it's gonna be. And that can both seem like very limiting and also very liberating, depending on how you think about things, right? And I think it's also important to note that not only do we think about determinism individually, but there are also these ideas of both structural determinism and social determinism, which mean essentially that our actions and decisions are also determined by structures and systems of society, as well as in sort of social constructs, right? And that is a conversation for a different day, because that is way beyond the scope of what we're talking about now. But I say all this to say we can contrast that with this concept of free will, which very simply is the belief that we control our narrative. Like, we act at our own discretion. There is nothing determined. And I'll just say sort of more practically, like, I think this comes up in therapy oftentimes. Like, if I'm working with someone who, let's say that they are, both of their parents, like biological parents, have a certain like mental health condition, right? Like, let's say maybe it's schizophrenia or addiction. And so the person that I'm working with can feel like no matter what they do, that's going to be their same fate, because maybe they feel like biology indicates that that's going to be their future, like what have you. But again, for some people, determinism and feeling like no matter how hard I try, this is going to be my fate is very limiting, and it's upsetting, right? Because it's like, well, then why would I even try? Why would I even do what I need to do, right? And so to me, this is a staple throughout all three Back to the Future films. And we hear Doc Brown say it more than once, that no one should know too much about their future. In the first film, right, when in 1955, and when Doc Brown is trying to send Marty back to 1985, and Marty is working his hardest to tell Doc Brown, like, you need to know that on this date in 1985, you're going to be shot. And Doc Brown keeps telling him, like, nope, I don't want to know anything about that. Like, he very much is in this deterministic mindset, right? Like, if that's what's supposed to happen, that's what's going to happen. Like, it is what it is, right? In the second film, and again, which is sort of at the end of the first film, but is the sort of catalyst and precipitating event for the entirety of the second film. But there's this idea that Doc Brown and Marty have to go to the future because there's something that happens with Marty's kids that creates, quote, a chain reaction that ruins their whole family. So again, there's this idea that if we don't intervene, this whole chain reaction of cause and effect events is going to just create a whole lot of shenanigan for your family, right? What I very much appreciated about Back to the Future 3, and I don't know, again, because I'm very new to this fandom, I don't know how people feel about Back to the Future 3, but to me, sort of thematically, it was such an amazing resolution because we're introduced to Clara, right? And Clara is sort of this variable that comes in, right? And Doc's whole world is turned upside down. He got them hard eyes, look like the hard eyes emoji, like he out here just trying to be with this woman. And I think we see this tension that he experiences because he knows that, like, he can't be with her, right? Because if he does that, all of these events of the future that are already predetermined are not going to happen, and that's going to cause, like, a whole ruckus, right? And so although Doc Brown feels and believes in his heart of hearts that this is his person, and he wants to be with this woman, he is conflicted, right? Because he is operating from a determinist mindset. And again, I think one of my most favorite things, one of my most favorite scenes from the trilogy is when Marty McFly sings Johnny Be Good at the dance. I just think that was a vibe. It was a vibe. I was here for it. But the last scene of Back to the Future 3, where Doc Brown returns with, spoiler alert, Clara and their two kids, and he says, and this is sort of like his whole last sort of experience was phenomenal. His whole last line was phenomenal. His last lines. But I think what was particularly interesting to me was when he said, quote, "Your future hasn't been written yet. No one's has. Your future is whatever you make it. So make it a good one." Like, a tear came out of my eye, not only because that was super dope what he said, like, that was amazing. And again, we see this transformation in his way of thinking. He's sort of liberated. I would use the word liberated. His way of thinking, in that it's okay if you know about your future because you can change it if you want to. And again, we see this transition from thinking in a very deterministic way to thinking more so as in a way that is related to sort of free will. And so I think that was just super interesting and amazing. I don't know how many other sort of film series have been sort of rounded out in such a beautiful way, but 5 stars, highly recommended. I think it was absolutely, absolutely amazing.